Thanks very much. It's great to be here. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about this book, but also kind of broaden your thinking about markets more generally. So this is the book, and when I came up with this title, and I told my publisher the title, he said, which by the way, the subtitle is Discovering Humanity in the World of Risk and Return. And he said, you know, provocation works with titles, but oxymorons don't. And then I thought to myself, but that's exactly the point. I wanted to bring together two ideas that people would never bring together and show that they're not nearly as disconnected as you might think. In truth, I fell into this, which is a way of saying I had no idea what I was doing when I started this book. I'm a pretty straight-up economist. But I was asked to give a talk to the graduating class. I came up with a talk about what's going on in financial markets, what's going on in the world, how it can be made better, and then I was told that's not what this talk is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about wisdom. So I committed to a title without knowing what I was going to do. I knew I had to talk about wisdom, and I know some finance, so I titled it The Wisdom of Finance. It turns out to be a remarkably easy thing to think about together, and that's what I'm here to convince you about. You know, more broadly, I think we are at a perilous moment where we are turning our back on markets, and I want to try to convince you that we need to restore our faith in markets. That's true on the left, that's true on the right. We are routinely turning our back on markets, and I think that we're doing that in labor markets with immigration. We're doing that in product markets with trade. We're doing that in capital markets by demonizing finance. It is an incredibly perilous moment. That doesn't mean markets are fantastic and they're going to fix every problem in the world. To the contrary. But we should come with an appreciation of what they do. So first, I think we've lost the headline a little bit. The last 3-4 decades have witnessed markets bringing 1 billion or 2 billion people out of poverty. That is the headline. Income inequality at a global level has fallen dramatically. These are the arbitrary lines of nation states which make us think about income inequality rising sharply. I'm not saying you have to care as much about people in India and China as you do about Americans, but just be aware that markets have done something transformative. Personally, I come from a country which has been transformed by markets in the last 3 decades, and let me tell you, they're spectacular. They're not all good, but they are remarkable, and we've lost that headline. Having said that, the last 3 or 4 decades have also seen markets be incredibly disappointing. We lived through corporate governance crises, we lived through really, really bad behavior, we lived through the financial crisis. And so we also have become enormously disappointed in these markets. From my perspective, we need markets more now than ever. We need markets to diffuse technologies, we need markets to create wealth, we need markets to do all kinds of things, and yet we are skeptical, more skeptical than we've ever been before. So how are we going to change this? So the first thing I'm going to say is I think if you demonize markets and you're outraged by them, that's great. I don't know if that's going to help the world, particularly because what we've done so far is make finance and markets more and more evil, which, by the way, makes it only easier for these people to behave according to lower and lower standards. If you think regulation is going to solve this problem, you should be aware that many regulators are captured by the industry, and regulation has a lot of counterproductive effects. So what can we do? So the first thing is I think we've got to demystify and rehabilitate finance. Demystify means for people on the outside who are intimidated by it, who think it's evil, they should come to understand it. They should come to understand its power. Second, finance is broken. There's way too much value extraction going on. It's terrible. We have to fix that. How do we do that? So 50 years ago, C.P. Snow delivered this lecture and this tiny little book called Two Cultures, where he bemoaned the gap between science and the humanities. And he said that they've grown apart and they no longer are connected to each other, and it's a complete loss to everybody. That same thing has basically happened with business and the humanities and finance and the humanities. I witness this most days when I cross the river between the Harvard Business School and Harvard Law School, and the business school where people have sometimes have too instrumental a view of knowledge and view the humanities as something too abstract to be useful. And I cross the river and see people who view business and money as crass and demeaning. Both of those views are silly. And in fact, the way to reunite these two perspectives is through the humanities. It turns out the humanities are incredibly powerful for helping understand the moral content of our lives, and in particular, the moral content of markets. Most people think markets are against humanity. Let me just try to give you a couple of examples of why that's wrong. In fact, markets are core to our humanity. That is a really hard claim, but I think you'll see why it's true. First, the epigram to my book is money is a kind of poetry. That's by Wallace Stevens. You might think he's some high-minded investment banker who thinks money is poetry. You'd be wrong. Wallace Stevens, I think, is arguably the best poet of the last century in America. But he spent his entire career working at the Hartford, an insurance company, and he never left the Hartford. Harvard offered him the Charles Eliot Norton Professorship of Poetry. He said, no, I want to stay at the Hartford. He loved insurance because he understood that actually insurance and actually the problems that he was dealing with poetry are actually related. I'm not going to read you this full quote, but this really, hopefully, will upend your idea. There's a quote from Nietzsche who basically says, the most elemental relationship there is in humankind is that between a creditor and a debtor, between a buyer and a seller. We've been doing it for millennia. This is just a way of trying to upend your sense that markets are outside of humanity. Markets, in fact, are core to our humanity. How are we going to demonstrate that? So I'm just going to talk about a couple of stories. What I do in the book is just try to talk about stories. As an economist, we don't trust stories. The best part about writing this book is I believe in stories again. They organize our minds. And a lot of people understood this. So in The Merchant of Venice, that's the upper left-hand corner, nominally it's a play about debt, but of course it's a play about commitments. It's a play about bonds. Bonds in both sense. And there's all that wordplay, because Shakespeare understood that that fundamental relationship is actually a parallel for things we have in our lives all the time, commitments we make to each other. That's Jane Austen at the bottom. 150 years before we developed modern portfolio theory and Black-Scholes-Merton option pricing, Jane Austen and Anthony Trollope were talking about risk management problems. In their cases, the problems of young women facing a really uncertain marriage market. In fact, Jane Austen is very clear about this. Men can make mistakes. Children can make mistakes. Young women cannot make mistakes. They intuit the idea of options and diversification as a solution to this problem, way before we started talking about finance in the way we do now. This is the parable of the talents from the Bible, the book of Matthew, which John Wesley used, the founder of Methodism, used to talk about how powerful an idea it is to multiply wealth and how that's a parallel for what we do in our lives. We are stewards. We are stewards of other people's resources, and we should try to multiply them. That, in fact, is the recipe in finance for value creation. These worlds that you think of as being very distant and unrelated are completely connected. If nothing else, Mel Brooks understood with the producers. That's, of course, the story of corporate governance. That's the story of the principal agent problem that is rife in capitalism. By the way, not all the stories are bad. The bottom left is the last story I tell in the book, which is from O Pioneers and Willa Cather. So that story is fantastic because it belongs in every finance textbook. She does a leveraged buyout of a farm. She merges farms. She buys options. She diversifies. She does everything you would do in a finance textbook, and yet she emerges as this most wonderful person. Most people who go into finance don't, but she understands that you don't confuse luck and skill. And in finance, people have gotten confused about the fact that their behavior represents skill rather than luck. In fact, in finance, there is no field where it's easier to dress up luck as skill. Last thing I wanted just to share with you is I think we also need to expect less from markets. We are simply expecting too much. First, I think we're living through the revolution of rising expectations. We expect that this phenomenal period of growth that preceded these last decades or two will repeat itself. And we are about to turn our back on markets in a significant way because of those rising expectations. That, I think, is going to be completely tragic. The alternative is far worse in many, many ways. Similarly, we allow now markets into all kinds of places. The way we do public housing in this country is through the low-income housing tax credit, which is a market-based instrument for building public housing. It's a very inefficient way to do it, probably. We have nonprofits saying, we need a triple bottom line. We need to show an ROI. That's the language of business permeating everything. Families use work management software to manage activities. It's everywhere. And in fact, that represents the failure or the kind of falling apart of these more private domains where market logics don't work. That doesn't mean markets are bad. That means we need to have a different logic for those domains, like a powerful state. We've convinced ourselves CEO business people are good presidents and professional politicians don't matter. It's probably wrong. Markets are wonderful, but they don't provide everything. But they are wonderful. We're at a really important moment, and I encourage you not to turn your back on them. They're incredibly precious, and we are at a moment which, if we do turn our back on them, the alternative is, I think, far, far worse. My basic message is, first, there's a huge amount of humanity in these markets. Don't demonize them. Try to understand what they are, and try to appreciate them. And don't expect that they're going to cure every problem in the world. They're not well suited to that. We have governments for that. We have the nonprofit sector for that. We have families for that. We have all kinds of institutions. Okay, so that's the book, and I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks.